Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. On today's episode, I am excited to release the second part of a two-part conversation with Dr. Thomas Schreiner, a world-class New Testament scholar. Dr. Schreiner is the James Harrison Professor of New Testament Interpretation and Professor of Biblical Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He has authored or co-authored more than 30 books. He specializes in the Pauline epistles and Pauline theology and is the co-editor of a book entitled Women in the Church. In our last episode, Dr. Schreiner explained that there are two main positions as it relates to the view of women's role in the church and in the home. The first view is known as Egalitarianism, which is the view that men and women are equal in dignity, worth, and there are no distinctions in roles between men and women in the church and in the home. We then went on to discuss the ways that an errantist, that is someone who believes the Bible contains errors, would argue for egalitarianism, and how an inerrantist, one who does not believe the Bible has errors in the original manuscripts, would argue for egalitarianism. Dr. Schreiner then went on to define and describe what complementarianism is, the view that he and myself both hold to. He explained that complementarianism is the view regarding women's role, which teaches that men and women are equal in dignity and worth, but that men and women do have God-given, distinct, and complementary roles in the church and in the home, which honor God. In today's episode, we pick up where we left off. We will discuss the interpretation of key passages of Scripture, including Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, and 1 Timothy 2. Please listen in with me to my previously recorded conversation with Dr. Thomas Schreiner. Well, we do want to get to some exegesis of some of the most important biblical texts as it relates to the subject of the essential role, and we want to emphasize essential role of women in the home and in the church, because it is essential. Let's start with what is often called the household codes. We find them in Ephesians 5:22-33 and Colossians 3:18-19. And the Apostle Paul wrote these two epistles to two different churches around the same time while under house arrest in Rome. And in Ephesians 5:22, we read, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." Dr. Schreiner, how are we to understand this passage?
Yes. Well, I think the wording of the text is pretty clear. I think the word husband is head most naturally means authority there. I think in Ephesians 1, you have this, Paul tells us that Jesus is the head over every ruler and authority, and those are angelic powers, maybe only demonic powers. So I think clearly he's not saying the source. He's the source of demonic powers in that context, but he's the authority. Another good argument for it being authority in Ephesians 5 is he calls on the wife to submit. Well, it makes sense in context. Words take their meaning in context. It makes sense that the word would mean authority if he's calling upon a woman to submit. I was in a debate with a person where they said, no, that means you're the source of your wife. And I said to him, how am I the source of my wife? I said, I'm not her physical source. Actually, I became a Christian through the person who's now my wife. So I'm not her spiritual source even, really. And they couldn't answer me. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he's talking just about physical source there. He's talking about a role differentiation there. And I don't think it's just cultural, because he compares it to, he anchors it to Christ's relationship to the church, as the church submits to Christ. So that's I think a transcultural truth. And in fact, in 5:32, he says, what he says about marriage is a great mystery, and I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. And I think what Paul is saying there is marriage mirrors the relationship between Christ and the church. Marriage is rooted in the created order, the good creation that God made. And I think you could even argue in Genesis, Adam being created before Eve, Eve being created as a helper, the command being given to Adam and not Eve. I think there's indications of differences of role there as well, even though they're equal in dignity, value, and honor. She's bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh, right? And the woman came out of the man. So, yeah, I would argue that's a transcultural word, that there are role differences between men and women.
Well, I've heard the argument in class by a student who is quoting someone else, another person, that, well, in Ephesians, the word submit isn't in Ephesians 5:22. It's just before it, submit one to another. But then I took them to Colossians, and it is clear in Colossians the word submit is there. So these two household codes, submit one to another, starts the discussion, right? So then it's implied then next, isn't it? I mean, you have to have a verb in a sentence. You're a Greek New Testament scholar. How would you understand Ephesians 5:22 without that word submit?
I think 5:21 says, in the church, the way I interpret it, in the church, we're to submit to one another, generally speaking. That's our stance towards one another. But then you've got Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, Titus 2, 1 Peter 3. No, in every place, wives are to submit to their husbands. Never does it say husbands are to submit to their wives. So I think that's significant. There's, in every one of these passages, you have these role differences. He easily could have said, and husbands, 5:25, submit to your wives. Now, it is true, he says husbands love your wives, right? And in Colossians as well. And in 1 Peter, live in an understanding way with your wives. But he doesn't use the word submit. So I think it's a mistake to derive from 5:21 that husbands are to submit to their wives. He easily could have said that. But I think because the husband is the head, the husband has the responsibility, not privilege, responsibility as a leader to love and cherish and protect and lead his wife. And people read too much into 5:21. We have to pay attention to what the texts actually say. And I think the history of the church here is significant. I acknowledge some went too far, right? Some of the church fathers argued, a lot of them argued actually, that women were inferior. And inferior in intelligence. And of course, I think those are mistakes. I think they were very influenced by Aristotle in that regard. I mean, Aristotle was very influential, but Aristotle's not scripture. And I think some of the church fathers read Aristotle into these texts. But of course, Paul, the biblical writers, never say such a thing.
So would it be a good summary to say Paul begins by saying submit one to another, and then he gives these various categories of how that looks between husband and wife, between child and parent, and between slaves and masters?
I don't think when parents are commanding their children, they're submitting to them. Right. So I think submitting to one another in 5:21 is a general exhortation. And then I don't think masters submit to their slaves.
Right.
Because he continues, he says, this, when you look at these particular relationships, these are your responsibilities and roles.
Exactly. Yep. Very good. And as we think of, I talk to my students about how that manifests itself, a husband that loves his wife like Christ loves the church and is willing to die for her, that means he's willing to listen to her He, like you said, cherishes her. So in practical, everyday interaction, it's let's talk about, let me hear what you have to say. Let's dialogue. Let's think through what's the best for our family, for you, for me. What does God want for us? So that's very different than just saying, obey me, right? That's not what a complementarian position says. A biblical complementarian position that's not out of balance, that's not abusive, says.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's why I say it's not a privilege, it's a responsibility. It isn't, nowhere are we enjoined to say to our wives, you need to submit to me. That's not what Scripture says we're to do. It says we're to love our wives. We're to love our wives even if they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And and conversely, wives are to submit to their husbands even though husbands are imperfect. Now, of course, I think everybody would say this. If a husband asks the wife to sin, obviously the wife should disobey. I believe if a husband said to a wife, don't go to church, the wife shouldn't obey that. Her first devotion is to Christ. In my First Peter commentary, I quote Plutarch, and Plutarch says the wife should have all the friends of her husband, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact quotation, but something like, and worship the gods of her husband. Well, Peter doesn't agree with that. Right? The wife, and the other biblical writers, the wife's first devotion is to Christ. But then, what does it mean to be a wife? It means to be inclined. Your inclination and dispositions are to follow your husband's leadership. And the husband's inclinations and dispositions are to love and cherish and care for his wife, which means listening very carefully, often probably doing what the wife says, my wife, incidentally, is a very feisty wife, and I like that. My wife is strong. She has a stronger personality than I do. And I love that about my wife. And often she's right. And we go with what she says. And I invite her to share her opinion with me. And probably even if I don't invite her, she's going to tell me.
So it's as unto the Lord, right? That's what Paul says, that this is worshipful on both parts. It's worshipful for the husband to love their wife, and it's worshipful for the wife to respect her husband.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's to the Lord, ultimately. It's our relationship with God.
And again, just practically how it manifests itself, I say it this way: 95% of the time, my wife and I come to the same conclusion as we talk things through, and there are things that I don't have a conviction about, about the house or this or that, and certainly willing to compromise on those things that are happy for her to make decisions on. But there, 5% of those things where maybe I have a strong opinion, I think it's the direction we should go, and maybe she has a different opinion, but it's in those 5%. Just putting a number at it, it's not possible to, obviously give a tangible number, but it's in those in those times that my wife, and I'm sure your wife as well, says, I'm willing to respect your opinion on this or submit to your, because I know you have what's best for me and for our family in mind. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm sure this is true for you as well, there are times where we disagree, and for various reasons, I say, yeah, okay, we'll do what you say. Even though I disagree. It depends. But if I feel strongly enough, then we go my direction, even if she doesn't agree. So, yeah.
Well, the teaching of Paul found in Ephesians and Colossians is not unique to Paul, is it? Is there any other passages that you think of that it's not just Paul being biased by his culture or trying to bring them beyond the culture that they're in, if you will? Is it found elsewhere in Scripture?
Yes. Well, we mentioned Titus 2, of course, that is Paul, but also 1 Peter 3. We have, 6 verses there address to the wives. And of course, Peter calls upon the example of Abraham and Sarah, seeing precedents in the scriptural world as well. So Peter emphasizes having a gentle and quiet spirit. Actually, it's interesting because Peter uses the word submit, but also the word obey. And some people say, well, obey is not the right word to use. Obviously, it's not like the obedience of a child, right? But I think it shows us the semantic range of the word submit. Submit means you place your will under someone else. So I don't think the semantic range between submit and obey is so radically different. We recognize the relationship between a husband and wife is different from a parent and child by the very nature of the relationship, but not the verbs necessarily. The verbs themselves don't communicate that, which I think Peter shows us, because he transitions from the word hupotasa to hupakuo, from submit to obey.
Very good. Well, let's now turn our attention to the essential role of women in the church. And again, we emphasize how essential is it, right? There's no replacement for the role of women in the church or in the home, right? It's an essential role. Let's look at a complementarian position as it relates to 1 Timothy 2, 8-15, which seems to be one of the clearest passages that indicate that God, in his plan for the church, there are unique roles that complement each other. I'll read verses 11-13 from 1 Timothy 2. Beginning in verse 11, we read, "A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression." First of all, would you comment on the command for women to be learners? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's very significant. Paul says that women can learn. So I just happened to be looking at this text yesterday in class, and probably 30% of my class or so is female. And I just said, at Southern Seminary, we're so glad we have female students. And Paul says here that it's women should learn, and we believe that they should know the Bible and theology, and we think of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus in Luke chapter 10, 38 and following, and hearing his word. So we celebrate women getting a theological education and being equipped in a broad sense for ministry. So we're very enthusiastic about that, and it's a great thing that so many women today are getting theological education. And I'd say probably in our MDiv program, I don't know, I'm terrible at statistics, but maybe 30% are women.
And you would say that this was a bit countercultural, wasn't it, B, for Paul to say this?
Absolutely. Yeah. To return to something I said earlier, that I think both Jesus and Paul are very countercultural on women. And we see, again, remember those women in the 10 women in Romans 16, and Priscilla. Paul had a very high view of women and their intelligence and their giftedness for ministry endeavors.
So it seems that Paul doesn't have a problem with going against culture, right? If there's a model that is God's plan, he's going to go with it, whether it's the cultural perspective or not.
Right. And we see that in his ministry to the Gentiles, because it creates a lot of conflict and even persecution for Paul.
Which again, I think goes against the argument that Bill Webb and others are making, that Paul was just trying to bring them to beyond their culture a little bit. But it seems that Paul and Jesus, like you said, have no problems with going against the norm. Well, Paul seems to give two commands here to women. Would you agree? If so, please repeat for our listeners what those are and why they're important.
Well, I mean, the first one you already pointed out in terms of learning, but also learning with submissiveness, because I actually think in the text what he's concerned about is women arrogating to themselves a position and a role that's not proper. So he adds that word submissiveness. Yes, learning is good, but it needs to be submissive and in their learning. And then he says, I don't, in verse 12, maybe those are the two you wanted to focus on. Mm-hmm. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. So, that's the second word. Everybody, maybe not everybody knows this, but I've probably talked about this too much. But that second word, authentane, of course, it's the only time it occurs in the New Testament, and neither does that word occur anywhere in the Greek Old Testament. So that word has been the subject of a lot of debate. But I'm very convinced by Al Walter's article in our book, Women in the Church, Fresh Analysis of 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15, third edition, that the word means exercise authority. And I also think Andreas Kostenberger has shown that when you have a pairing like that, those are two infinitives there, teach or exercise authority, that they're either both, now this is very important to catch, that they're either both intrinsically positive or intrinsically negative. So, and I think Andreas rightly shows, teaching is an intrinsically positive activity. Actually, Paul uses another word, heterodidaskaleo, I think it is, for false teaching. But here he just uses the word didasko, to teach. So both teaching and exercise authority are inherently positive activities. There's nothing wrong with them. So it isn't that it's wrong for someone to teach or exercise authority. It's wrong for women to do it in this particular way, in this context, because mm-hmm. the activities in and of themselves are fine. Mm-hmm. In other words, to be maybe a little bit clearer, the pastors, the elders, the overseers, and I see those all as the same office, pastor, elder, overseer. Pastors, elders, and overseers are to teach and exercise authority. And I think Paul says that in the very next passage. 1 Timothy 3 on the elders and overseers. The elder overseer, he says they're to be apt to teach and they're to manage the church and their own household well. Well, that's teaching and exercising authority. And in 1 Timothy 5:17, he speaks of the elders who rule well. So I think elders have a particular responsibility to teach and exercise authority. And what Paul's saying here is that's part of the pastoral office, and women are not to do that.
Yeah, so Paul is writing to a pastor of a church, Timothy, right? And but we do see two distinct commands here, right? Some want to combine it into one command, but it seems to be teach or usurp authority, right?
Yes, and I think, again, I point to...
Or exercise authority, excuse me.
Yes, I point to our book where Andreas Kostenberger, I think, makes that argument. And I haven't seen, we're wide open to critiques, but Andreas wrote this in 1995. We're hoping, Lord willing, for a fourth edition of this book. I haven't seen anybody that I think has effectively shown Andreas's view to be wrong. Mm-hmm. A lot of people disagree with it, but they actually don't do much linguistically or exegetically with his arguments. They tend to just say, well, I disagree. Well, I don't think that's very persuasive.
You need some validation, don't you?
Yes.
Well, as it relates to these two commands, it does seem to me that the Spirit of God led the Apostle Paul to include some arguments that are transcultural, that is not tied to the culture or any culture, not the culture of the first century. And it is as if he knew that this would be a polarizing subject and therefore provides some rationale for his plan or argumentation for his plan. And these transcultural arguments are: man was created first, and second, Eve was deceived. Would you please explain the significance of these two transcultural arguments by Paul?
Yes. So for Adam was formed first and then Eve. So the first thing I want to say is Paul grounds the command in God's good creation, in the creation of Adam and Eve. And Paul perceives in the order in which they're created, which Genesis emphasizes, right, that Adam is formed first and then Eve comes out of his rib sometime later. Paul sees significance in that. And I've heard people say, well, that's a dumb argument that Paul makes, right? I've heard people actually say that because animals were created before human beings. But my response to that is always, well, of course, Paul knew that. He read the story of Genesis. He saw that animals were created before human beings. But Paul's reading the Old Testament narrative very carefully, and he says, look, the narrative order in which this took place, it's significant. So the egalitarians, they just regularly say, that command, a woman can't teach or exercise authority over a man, it's not binding today, because Paul says that because the women are uneducated, or he says that because women are promulgating the false teaching, maybe the Artemis cult or whatever they say nowadays. But Paul easily could have said that. He easily could have said, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, because right now they're uneducated. That's not hard to say. He could have easily said, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man because they're duped by the false teaching, which, as Don Carson points out somewhere, if the women and all the women were duped by false teaching, that's rather strange, isn't it? Only women and all the women? Actually, the only false teachers Paul mentions are men. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he doesn't even mention any women false teachers. Maybe there were some, but he never mentions them. So, but instead, Paul, what does he appeal to? He appeals to God's good creation. It is the same argument he uses in Romans 1 for why same-sex relations are wrong, that they're contrary to nature, by which clearly Paul means it's contrary to God's created intention in making and creating man and woman, which is why, right, we're seeing this in the mainline churches now. The mainline churches have accepted women's ordination for years, and they've collapsed on the same-sex issue. One of the reasons they've collapsed is they had no hermeneutical basis any longer. Right now, I'm not saying the issues are equally clear. I don't think they are equally clear, but it is true. Paul gives the same reason for both of them, and so I've read lots of egalitarian writers on this, and it's very interesting to me what they do with verse 13, because they say things like, "Well, it's very unclear. It's very hard to understand," and is it? I don't think it's so hard to understand. I think it's actually a rather simple statement. Adam was formed first and then Eve. Wow. I think the difficulty's in the eye of the beholder. So that's the first argument. The second argument, yes, the second argument is harder. Yes. So I totally acknowledge that because he says Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was. Many people argue historically from this text that women are more apt to be deceived than men. I think that's a possible reading. I don't think that's a ridiculous reading. I want to pay attention to text. If that's how someone takes that text, I am not going to sneer, even though that's not a popular interpretation today. I'm not going to sneer at that. But I actually think just reading the whole Bible and what Paul says in Romans 7 and other places, I don't think there's any sin without deceit. Because when we sin, I don't think we sin thinking I'm going to destroy myself. I'm going to ruin my life. I'm going to die. So I don't think he's saying Adam ate and thought, okay, I'm destroying my whole life. I think what he's saying, the serpent subverted, it's a very quick reading of the creation account. The serpent subverted the creation order by tempting Eve and not Adam. So I think he's saying that the serpent's designs weren't on the head in the relationship, but the wife, and he's subverting the created order. And I think his point is Eve was deceived first, and therefore it's really the same argument. In both cases, this creation order is subverted. Now, not everybody accepts my argument there. I think verse 13 is clear enough. Verse 14 is not necessary for the argument, but I think that's what's happening. And I think he's basically making the same argument.
It does seem that there was order and roles before the fall, right? It seems that's Paul's argument, that it wasn't a post-fall condition, but Paul's tying it to, would you say that Adam was failing as his responsibility, and in that sense Eve as well in the fall account, where Adam failed to be the leader he was supposed to, and as you mentioned, Eve stepped over that created order that God had installed?
Yes, I think that's right. The way I read the Hebrew text there, that Adam was with Eve the whole time and passively stood by. And I'm attracted by what Greg Beale says, that he should have evicted the serpent out of the garden, but he didn't. He just let this whole thing occur, and he should not have done that. Yeah, I think that's correct.
So it is a reminder to us as men that is our responsibility. Our role is to protect our homes and our churches from false teaching, isn't it? To lead well and to protect our families, including our wives.
Right, absolutely.
Well, verse 15 is a challenging verse, isn't it? As it relates to this argument, then we read, "But women will be preserved through the bearing of children." Would you please explain what you think this phrase means?
Well, that's a very disputed verse. I don't think my case depends on my reading of verse 15. There are good people who disagree with me. So some people, George Knight, for example, who's a complementarian in his commentary on the pastoral epistles, thinks this refers to the birth of Christ. I think that's very attractive. I don't think that's very clear, but could be. I'd like that idea. So my co-author Andreas Kostenberger says they're saved from the deceit of Satan. Another reading is that it's talking about being preserved physically during childbirth. First of all, I don't think Paul ever uses the word sozo or soter in the pastoral epistles for physical preservation. But again, I respect that view. A lot of people hold that view. I don't know exactly what that means, since a lot of women do die in childbirth. Right. Then they say,
that's Keener's position, right?
Yeah, that's Keener's view. Moyer Hubbard at Talbot holds this view. He's written an article on it. But then they'll say, well, yeah, a lot of women die. I don't. So I just don't find that very persuasive. I think Paul's talking about spiritual salvation, but in terms of perseverance. And he's saying, what he's essentially saying is, no, he's not saying you have to have babies to be saved. After all, he commends the single state in 1 Corinthians 7, and he recognizes not everybody's going to get married, and not every married person is going to have children. But I think what he's saying is, what does it mean to live out your life as a woman? You live it out distinctly in a way a woman lives it out, and that the example of that is having babies, which is why I think he instantly goes to if they continue in faith, love, and sensibility, because he doesn't want them to think, yes, you have to have a baby. He just gives a representative example. Here's an example of what it means to live out your life as a woman. You embrace what it means to be a woman. And again, I always say to my students now, I am so struck with this text, especially in the last few years, where our culture is so radically confused about what it even means to be a man and a woman anymore. Because in a way, what Paul wrote there, sometimes people even are almost embarrassed about it, but we need to hear it.
Yeah.
So...
Well, I think I take your view, maybe a little bit of a nuanced or variation of that, but out of that comes great fulfillment, right? When you, and I think that I was talking to Dr. Butterfield about that as well, that this is a beautiful thing that God has given that we as men can't participate in, and God has made women to have this maternal instinct and to love and to care for their children and to nurture them. And of course, Paul even uses that illustration to the Thessalonians, that he nurtured them like a loving mother. And so there does come great fulfillment in that. And I cited Dr. Constable, a professor of mine's wife. They had no children, and that's his take on this passage too. They had no children, but his wife, who wasn't able to have children, but she became a mentor to women and became a grandmother to children, and she still found great fulfillment in that role, that God-given responsibility. Would you say that I'm continuing your thought in those statements?
Yes. I think that's a beautiful thing. That mothering instinct is still manifested in the women of God who give themselves to others, and even in counseling. Right? That's there's a motherly kind of counsel and friendship that's a beautiful thing.
Well, the title of this podcast episode is The Essential Role of Women in the Home and in the Church, and my emphasis is upon essential, right? This is what a complementarian should believe. We can never praise enough. We cannot overemphasize the vital role of women in the church and in the home. Dr. Schreiner, would you share more about this vital role and how no man can fulfill this role?
Yeah. I think, when we're thinking of the home, we were just speaking of this. There's a tie, right, between a mother and her children that a father can never replace that. I mean, I think of my own mom. I'm sure you do as well. So thankful for my dad, but my mom played a unique role, and what a privilege it is to be a mother or a wife. Again, I think of my own marriage. My wife has played such a vital role. Well, I already told you I became a Christian through my wife, so that's amazing, right? But also, she's just played such a vital role in my ministry and supporting and praying and assisting in countless ways.
How about in the church? We need, as you mentioned, women that have studied, that know the scriptures, that teaching children, teaching other women, discipling. Would you develop that a little bit more?
Yes. So, again, I'm going to just use our church as an example. We have a very vital women's ministry. Right now, our church is not a huge church, 400 to 450. We have, I think, 4 or 5 women's Bible studies going right now. So we have women who are excellent teachers teaching these classes to other women. So we have a vital ministry of women to women in our church. Not only that, we have a retreat every year, a women's retreat. We have regular panel discussions where the women are discipling, instructing other women. Then we have mentoring relationships where women are meeting one-on-one with women. To be honest, Paul, I think the women are doing a bit more than we are as men in terms of having ministries in the church, formal ministries, right? I mean, there's no way as men we have 4 or 5 Bible studies going right now. So there are many valuable ministries. And actually, I wrote a chapter on this in the book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I wrote a chapter called something like The Valuable Ministries of Women. So, if people ask me, are women to be in ministry? I always say, of course. Women are to be in ministry. They minister in so many countless ways. Again, the 10 women in Romans 16. But then I say, but I think you're asking me if women can be pastors.
Right.
Yes, there are many valuable ministries women can fulfill, but no, they shouldn't serve as pastors.
Well, just one anecdotal story. Thanksgiving last year, we're going around the grandma. My mother-in-law asked the children to say what they're thankful for, and they went around the different children, got to my son, and my son, who's 5.5 years old at the time, they asked, "What are you thankful for?" And Jeremiah said, "I'm thankful that Jesus doesn't change." And I'm thinking, that is not me. That wasn't my investment into Jeremiah, that this profound theological statement was made by a 5.5-year-old, that Jesus doesn't change, right? That he's the same yesterday, today, forever, that he loves us. And although society, things change around us, he doesn't. And so that's the mentorship and love and discipleship of a mother. So I asked Rosaria, Dr. Butterfield, to share this as well as we conclude this podcast. Or any thoughts or challenges you might give to a mother that somehow in the culture in which we live feels like they're insufficient if they're not a career-driven person or don't have all these items on their CV, right, on their resume, as far as this vital role of women in the church and in the home?
One thing I'd say is to touch another human life the way a mother influences a child. That is, what a privilege. It's hard work, and there are discouraging days, right, at times. But to be able to touch other human beings in such a profound and deep and enduring way. I think, I'm not dissing a woman who's in a career, but I think some women who are in careers and didn't have children or didn't spend time with their children, sometimes they look back and they regret it, that they didn't spend that time with their children. So to be able to invest yourself in the life of a child in a deep and profound way. And of course, that may happen as you're working as well. I recognize that. That is a privilege, and we ought not to let our society tell us anything different. Our society, both you and me both know this. It can be very entranced with degrees, but really, God doesn't care, right? In a way, I think of it in terms of my own life. The people on my own cul-de-sac where I live, they don't care that I have a PhD. It's meaningless to them. And in a sense, God doesn't care either. God doesn't care about our position. That's a very secular view. And, what God cares about is if we're investing in others for the kingdom, and that they're even husbands don't have, and fathers, I should say, don't have that same, typically, at least, that same kind of intensive time with the child that a mother has. That's a wonderful privilege, really. So it's hard, right? It's hard. It's a lot of work. I know this even as a grandfather now when we watch the kids. It's exhausting. So,
yeah, very good. Well, Dr. Schreiner, thank you for taking so much time to dialogue with me and to share your perspective and understanding from years and years of study of the text.
It's been great to be with you, Paul. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Dr. Schreiner, thank you for taking a substantial amount of time out of your very busy schedule to share with our listeners about this very important and often polarizing subject. And thank you for being willing to engage on this subject both in writing and in dialogues. You and I hold a position that is countercultural and not well received. So thank you for giving a clear, well thought out, and convincing position, but also doing it with grace and love. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us for today's program. If you have benefited from this podcast, would you like this program wherever it is you download your podcasts? And leave us a positive review. This will help our program become more visible to those who are looking for faith-affirming programming. I hope you'll join us again next week for another great podcast. But until next time, never forget, Bible and Theology Matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.